the Sermon on the Mount, and finally at the end of the Sermon on the Mount here, it occurs to me that always before, and I've read the Sermon on the Mount many, many, many times, I have never noticed I won't call them hyperboles, but I'll call them, what should I call them? These difficult sayings of Jesus. This time through, and maybe it's because I really haven't tried to explain it to myself or anybody else. But now, there are things in here, as you well know. I mean, I've said it a lot, and it's not empty when I say, I don't know what to do with this. So, but this last little piece, it amounts to a paragraph in an English Bible, I do know what to do with. It makes plenty of sense. Begins in verse 24 for us. Therefore, oh boy, stop. Therefore, well, the closest antecedent is where Jesus, what we have is verse 21 says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. And then he goes on to say, many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons and perform many miracles? Then I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers. Okay, therefore, in light of what? Well, I think it is in verse 21. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. I grew up in a legalist church tradition, where what that equaled is don't sin. If you don't sin, you can get into the kingdom of heaven. If you do only obedient response to what is in the Word, you go to heaven. And I don't see that, okay? Not anymore. And it's because of grace. Does that mean you don't have to obey anymore? Don't worry about that. No. I think because of grace, I am empowered to, and because of grace at work in my life, I find my delight in doing the will of my Father who is in heaven. Okay, I mean, I think I could jump up and down on that trampoline for a long, long time. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. Everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice. The last message I heard at our church here, the Crossings Midtown, from our campus pastor, it was a wonderful sermon. I mean, on every level. And at the top of the list of why I thought it was a great sermon is because he really interpreted the scripture well, bearing in mind its cultural context. And what he was fully loyal to the actual written word, and he applied it. He challenged us with application, and I just think that was a great sermon. And I think most of the people that left the auditorium on that day would have said the same. That was a great sermon. I mean, I even told my wife, that's the best sermon I've heard him preach ever. And it was very good. Well, that's wonderful. But my friend Derek, our campus pastor, would say, thank you. But whether he would say it out loud or not, I know he'd have it in his mind because I know him a little bit. I wonder if you'll do anything about it. See, that's where the rubber meets the road. When I was a young youth minister, one of my heroes was Donnie Hinkle. He was a California guy, but he was also, I've told you about the Hinkles and my family's connection, my personal connection with the Hinkles. Well, Don was the oldest of 4 brothers. He's still living. And he was a really good speaker. He still is. And I recall, I recall this phrase. I can't remember exactly when I heard him preach, but he did an expository on the passage, and then he said, "Okay, that's the what. Now we got to talk about the so what." I am still growing in my spiritual and emotional maturity to capture the so what in my mind and then act on it in my life. Well, that's what Jesus is saying here. Wow. I'm going to ask you to think with me about the crowd on the hillside where he gave this talk. Do you think that they were listening and one of their thoughts would have been, wow, this is a historical sermon. I mean, this will be remembered for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And it'll be referenced. Others will speak of it and teach from it. And I don't think so. Had I been there, I would have thought, wow, this guy, holy smokes. Well, of course, they wouldn't have said holy smokes. I don't know what words they would have used, but I'm convinced that they would not have just been awed with the theological and historical significance. I think they were like you and me as we're going through this. I think they were still trying to get their hands around it, their brain wrapped around it. Because many times through this talk, Jesus confronts their views and the traditional views that they held that had been preached and taught into them for virtually all their life. And so, like you and I mean, there was many things in this talk, this message, this sermon that were head scratchers. And yet, there were many things to act on. And Jesus said, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice. See, Jesus was offering a, how would I say it? It wasn't a tweaking, but it was a transformation, a new view of theology and philosophy. But if it stays in theology and philosophy and never gets into biography, well, he tells the rest. He said, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. Okay? Growing up in Oklahoma, where for 24 years we lived in, or 23 years, we lived in Tulsa, which geologically has a lot of shift and movement subterraneally. Well, that's true probably everywhere. So when you're going to build, you want to drill down, dig down until you hit the solid rock. This is especially true in Israel, where the geography Jesus was standing on. And so you dig down to the rock, and that's where you lay the foundation. And here's why. Because this is in verse 25. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock. You know this already, but I'm going to say it anyway. Life is hard. I think it's attributed to John Wayne on social media anyway. And it's true because it's on the internet. Anyway, John Wayne is said to have said, life is hard. It's harder if you're stupid. And I think he's right. Life is hard. Metaphorically, there's going to be rain and storms. There will be adversity. There will be things you have no control over. It's going to happen. And because of that, we must build our lives beginning with a foundation on the rock. And Jesus says, my interpretation is Jesus was saying, when you put my words into practice, you're like that wise man who built their house on the rock. And then he gives the alternative. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. And he didn't have to say, because it didn't have its foundation on the rock. I mean, it was obvious. There are consequences to whether or not we act on the truth that we receive. I'm still learning. I still have a long ways to go in my learning, in fact. But my desire and effort is to put into practice the truth that I discover, especially the truth that I discover in Scripture. How different would the world be? Let's just even say this much. How different would my life, my marriage, my family, my job be if I put into practice the truth that I discover in Scripture? Well, you can make your own assessment on that, but I know for me, all of those venues would be better, and in fact, significantly better. So the challenge today is, well, done a lot with the what. Now it's time for the so what. what will you do? Okay. All right, I'll see you next time on So Care with Stevie Boy.